Hey, this is Cam with Blacktail Studio again, and this is my DIY epoxy skateboard video. I'm going to show you how I made both of these quilted maple and epoxy skateboards in two parts. Here's part one. I'd originally planned to make these out of two separate pieces of maple, but after I cut into this one, I liked it so much I decided to make them both out of this same slab of maple. This is big leaf maple, which has some really cool quilting and burl patterns, also a little bit of curl in there. I was really happy with how this piece turned out. It didn't plane down quite as quick as I'm making it look in the video here. That was probably about 4 or 5 passes. I chopped it down to 1 pass for your viewing pleasure, but cleaned up really nice, not much tear out. And here I moved on to my really janky layout that I wanted to be able to just get a really rough idea on what the shape of these skateboards was going to be. I played around with 3 or 4 designs. I can't remember if I actually ended up choosing the one that I liked best here. But after I found roughly what I wanted, I marked 13 inches, which is as high as my bandsaw can cut. So I was going to cut off a 13-inch slab so I could resaw it to make the skateboard planks. If you don't know what resawing is, it's just sawing thinner strips of wood on your bandsaw. And you obviously don't have to resaw the wood if you're going to make your own skateboard. You could just buy a piece that's roughly 3/4 of an inch or an inch. But I wanted them both out of the same piece of maple, so this is what I had to do. Every bandsaw has its limit, and I'm pretty sure I found it here. It was a relatively clean cut. Probably wouldn't try it with any harder wood than this maple. Overall, relatively happy with how it turned out. I didn't want to have any bark on these skateboards. If you want bark in yours, you can definitely leave it in there. The epoxy will seal it all in. So I went at this with my debarking tools, which is basically old dull chisels. The dull actually helps get it out without scarring the wood that you leave. I used a Porter cable restorer, my angle grinder, anything I could use just to get this off and try to leave as much of that natural contour as I could. Depending on how hard or soft your wood is, you'll want to be careful using an angle grinder or different tools that I'm using here. This is a stainless wheel, and it didn't scar the wood really at all. That's a brass wheel on my drill. And I also used a nylon wheel on my restorer. So play around, but be careful not to scar the wood if you want to leave the look of it. I'm not a guitar builder or anybody that does really extensive dyeing, but I can show you what I did to get the look here. It turned out pretty nice. So I wouldn't hesitate to use it if I were you. All I'm using is denatured alcohol from Home Depot and TransTint liquid dye. And I just kept adding some until I got the color I liked. It's really concentrated, goes a long ways, but when you're making a big jar like this, you'd be surprised how much you end up having to use. Ended up adding a little bit more, and that was pretty close to the purple I wanted. I decided to dye the entire piece now, even though I'll be planing off the top and bottom layer later and having to re-dye it, which will make a little bit more sense in a few minutes when you get to that part. But for now, I decided to dye the entire piece purple and then do the other piece black. When you're working this fast, you gotta be careful of one thing, and that's spilling a giant load of dye all over your table saw and the floor. After I cleaned up the dye and composed myself, I got on to building the forms for these skateboards, which is basically the exact same process I did for any of my resin tables, if you've seen those videos. The only real difference when I built these forms was I didn't use any nails or screws. I just used the fast dry caulk, since it was only going to be about 3/4 of an inch of an epoxy. I wasn't too worried about it bursting out like a dam. I decided to seal the top, but not the center section where the epoxy is actually going to be. Not entirely necessary, but kind of a habit I've gotten into, so I went ahead and sealed both the top and bottom. This is a step you definitely don't want to skip, using the mold release spray. If you don't use this and you use melamine, you will literally have to cut and or plane off the epoxy, so make sure you use a good mold release and let all the dust settle, because it can actually settle into the epoxy if you use it right next to it, because it stays airborne for quite a while. Okay, this is the fun part. I'm using Epoxy 2-to-1 liquid plastic. There's a bit of a discussion in the thread of my last epoxy table build. You're just gonna have to trust me. This is the stuff to use. Epoxy 2-to-1. Most of the confusion comes from that Epoxy makes a 1-to-1 mix, but it's for casting very deep objects, and it never gets really, really hard. So the 2-to-1 gets rock hard. So this is why you want to use it for something like a skateboard or a table. Do not use the 1-to-1. There are a lot of companies out there that make different pigments. Epoxy makes some really cool pigments. I don't think this is actually an Epoxy pigment. They were sold out at the time. I love the color of it. I wish I would have added more in the end. You'll see it doesn't end up quite as pink as it does when I tested it out. It's a very pretty color. Again, I wish I would have added more though. When you're mixing it, you're gonna wanna use a power mixer like I have attached to my drill here. They cost like $4 at Home Depot. And try to maintain as little bubbles as possible, so keep it in there. And I like the clear cups for testing the color out. I ended up actually adding some additional epoxy with more pigment, and it still wasn't quite as much as I'd hoped when it cured in the end. But it was a pretty nice subtle pink in the end. There I go adding some more pigment. Mix it up nice and slow if you get that paddle right on top so you don't introduce a ton of bubbles. That was looking a little better. And pour it in nice and easy. There's no need to just splash it in like you see some of the videos online. I try to keep it as nice and gentle as I can. The neat thing about these powdered pigments opposed to like a liquid dye is that you can create designs in them, and you see all that pearl in there mixed with the pink. That made some really neat swirls, and I played around with using air and the knife and the spoon. Different things leave different patterns. The heat gun probably made my favorite pattern in the end. I liked it. Kind of left a billowy quilted, kind of matched the wood look actually. Spoon was kind of interesting too. Sometimes, depending on the temperature of your shop, it can take a little bit longer than 3 days, but this actually cured completely hard in a little under 3 days. And I like to use these wood wedges. They're just made out of 2x4s to help free it. And it's actually the caulk that is stuck, not the epoxy. But came off nice and clean. If you watched my last epoxy table build, you saw me go to Creative to use their big planer. And I could have run these skateboards on my planer, but I was bringing in 5 or 6 other tables to have planed, so I decided to bring this in too. You see that mold release actually was not allowing the blank to be fed through, so we had to push it through with a stick. And it took all the color with it. But as I mentioned before, I planned on losing the color on the top. What I wanted was, since the epoxy is going to be slightly transparent, I wanted when you looked through it to see the same color all the way through the wood. So this is the way I had to do it. And before you think I ruined this project, give me a little bit of time to prove myself. It'll all look very uniform in the end. Okay, that concludes part 1. If you wanted to see what they ended up looking like, please click over to part 2 now. Here's a quick teaser.